Welcome to this Tech Ability webinar, Grid 3 for Learning and Independence. Please press subscribe underneath the video if you want more of this content. And if it was useful, please hit like and leave us any feedback in the comments.
Hello everyone and welcome to Grid 3 for Learning and Independence, Tech Ability webinar. We're joined today by Kerry and Adam. So thanks Kerry and Adam for joining us. Do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and we'll get started?
Yeah, very quickly. So my name is Kerry and I'm the Training and Implementation Manager for Smartbox. So my focus is making sure that everybody knows how to use Grid and be able to support all the AAC users that they're working with.
Hi, and I'm Adam. I'm Head of Assessment at Smartbox. I've been in the world of assistive technology for a number of years now, and my role at Smartbox, I work quite closely with some of the specialist services for the NHS, and when I can, I get out and work with users on recommending and guiding on the right way forward for someone.
Great, well thanks for both joining us today. Any participants, feel free to ask any questions as you go along, and we'll have a bit of time at the end if you've got any particular queries you want to bring up. Okay, over to you.
Fab. So really brief introduction. Today's session is going to be almost a bit of a whistle-stop tour really. So Adam and I are going to give you lots of different ideas about how you can use Grid 3 for learning and independence. We'll show you lots of different resources, and hopefully the idea is that it'll prompt some questions from you. Just to give you an idea of the plan, we're going to think about resources for learning first, then we're going to talk about recording. We're going to do a little bit about communicating with peers, and then Adam's going to talk a bit about EC for motivation and independence as well. So I'll start off by sharing my screen. And Adam, if you let me know.
Yeah, all's good here. You can see the screen.
That's a great start. So the first thing that we're going to look at in this session, we're really going to just focus on learning. So thinking about the different ways that Grid can be used to create classroom grids. So some of the examples that we're going to look at in this session might not necessarily be exactly right for the users that you're working with, but I want you to think of them as templates and how you could almost adapt them and take the ideas for different users. The first thing that I wanted to highlight really was a lovely grid set created by Call in Scotland. Call Scotland, oh, I don't know why that's floating in the middle there, that's unusual. Call Scotland are using Grid, hold on, that might fix it, are using Grid with individuals in the classroom, and what you can see they've done here is pull lots of different grids together so that everything is in one place. So I just wanted to show you this as a really nice example of something you might want to do for some of the users you're working with. So across the bottom here, they've put access to some key tools. So we've got a camera in here, the calculator, obviously access to a keyboard and the notepad, but they've renamed it the Jotter because that's what they call it in their school. They've got access to a timetable at the top where you just go into each day.
Tuesday.
And you can see here that it's taken us back to the timetable. But then they've also got access to some of the key areas of learning that each individual is working on. So if I go into numeracy, you can see here I've got some different topics, and I go into shape, for example, with this one, and I've got access to some activities within there. So these just sit alongside the user's AAC, and they can come in and out of the grid set, but they've got everything in one place. So that was the first example that I wanted to talk about, and one thing that the grid, the core grid set has done is they've actually pulled in resources from online grids. So rather than creating everything from scratch, they found some of their favourite grid sets and they've pulled them in. The other thing when we think about learning that we quite often talk to schools and colleges about is around using what's already in the grid set, and that's really important. So instead of having to add loads and loads of vocabulary, we really encourage people to think about what's already there and what we might want to use and how we would work with the grid set. So I've just gone into one of our grids here. This is Supercore, and I'm in the teen and adult version here. The first thing I'd highlight is that there is an education section in these dynamic columns on the right hand side. If you go into education, we've got lots of different areas that we could focus on. So we could go into money, for example, and we get some key terminology here. But if I go into more, then you can see that I get lots of access to more vocabulary, and this vocabulary here on the right hand side stays the same. So if I jump back, I've got access to other topics like science, I've got access to a calculator, and I've also got some blank grids. So the education section has a starting point for things that you might want to use. You'll also notice at the top here, there's the college grids. So if we go into college, we get some vocabulary that's going to be useful for when we're around college in different subjects. But if I go into more, what you can see is that we've now got a grid which is here and available for you to be able to personalise with specific course vocabulary or friends, therapists, staff, anyone that the user might need to have the vocabulary available within here. And that's really important, I think, that we do, we talk a lot obviously about personalising, but these pages are designed specifically for you to personalise for the users. I'm going to jump back home. The other area that I draw your attention to is looking at topics. So within any of the grid sets that you're working in, there will be likely, it might not be called topics, but a topic or category based section. And in Supercore here, we've got lots of different topics that might be appropriate to use in a college environment. So whether that's sort of social care, relationships, health, there's lots of access to lots of different vocabulary in here. When you go in here, you'll notice a lot of these again have got blank spaces. So we'd encourage you to add more specific vocabulary into these sections as well. There's also blanks down the right hand side. So if there is a topic that's going to be really pertinent and there's language that they need to be using around that topic quite frequently, then you can use the blanks. They're set up in exactly the same format as all of the other grids. They've just not got the vocabulary populated for you. So that would always be my starting point. There's a lot of language in most of the vocabularies available here. But the other thing you can do is start to find where all the vocabulary might be, because even Adam and I, who use these all day, every day, don't know where all of the words are within the different grid sets. So there's a feature called Find Word, if you're not familiar with it, that you can use to access the grid set, the words in the grid set. So one way to do it would be to go into the menu, but the other way, if we're in Supercore, for example, is to go into this magic wand and select Find Word. Helps if you type the word first. So we go to my spelling grid. So if I'm the support worker, environment's a hard one to type.
Environment.
And then I go into magic wand and find word. And what this will do is guide me through to where that word with. So I know that it's in topics. I'm going to go into the environment page, and there I can access
Environment.
So there's loads of words that are going to be within any grid set that you're going to need to access. Some every day, some are going to be much rarer. So it's really important that we have tools to be able to find them. So that's just one example. I'm just going to clear that and go home. The other thing that I quite often talk about when we're working with schools is using what's in the grid set, and we would recommend you do this in the form of sort of using the descriptive teaching model is a really good example. If you're not sure what that is, there's some lovely videos available on YouTube, but that's, for me, I always describe it as quite often when I can't think of a word, what I might do is try and describe the object or the thing that I'm talking about. So the thing I use to dry the dishes in the kitchen, for example, I would say, describe that I want to dry the dishcloth. But if I can't find that word, I need to be able to, as we all do in conversation, we need to be able to actually be able to describe what we're talking about. It's actually a really useful communication skill. And it's also a way that we can work in the classroom to mean that we don't have to populate grid sets with loads of really specialist language. So if, for example, I was going to think about global warming, but it's not a word that exists, it's not vocabulary that's in my grid set, I could go into topics and I could go into space and I could select Earth.
Earth.
I'm going to jump home. I'm going to select Get. And then I'm going to pop into feelings and I'm going to add
Dot.
So I've described global warming. I've been able to demonstrate that I understand what global warming is, but what I've not had to do is go and move, excuse me, I've not had to go and add the word global warming in, but
yes, so I imagine though, Kerry, if your student did that with you, that'd be the point at with as a communication partner, you'd be suggesting, well, let's go and add that word.
yeah. So
Yeah.
again, it's about making sure that when we're using language, that we're giving students the way to find the word, that we're giving them the way to describe something that they're looking for. And then if we know it's a word that we probably do need to have in there, that we're then adding it to the vocabulary when it's appropriate. Okay, so that was some of that was some of the key things that we'd focus on around learning. I'm just going to jump back to Grid Explorer. And I want to move on really quickly and look at recording, because that's something that we get asked about all the time from schools and colleges, about the easiest way to do recording with students. So there's a few different examples that I'd share. The first one, going back into Supercore, would be thinking about if we're in the moment and we've captured a piece of work or a message that we want to share, it's actually, again, using what's within the grid set. So we have features within grid sets in Supercore, for example. So there's a share feature, and this allows us to be able to very quickly send what's in the message window as an email or save it as a note. So it's really quick in the moment. I want to capture that and record it as evidence for something the individual has achieved. I can simply email that to my tutor or save it as a note. So that's the first thing. In the moment's really important because it quite often happens and we just want to capture it and be able to save that. The other thing is, if we're thinking about it in advance, we might be wanting to think about how we're going to give them the opportunity to scaffold a piece of writing. So because I'm in Supercore, I'm going to focus on users who are using symbols. And to do that, I can go into the apps, and we have lots of different apps, but we have email, but we also have something called an email quick chat. Now, this is really nice for users who need support with their writing and the structure to their writing. We've pre-populated this, but if you had a task, which could be, for example, to write an email to your MP, then you would change these and edit them so that we're providing the scaffolding around the language and the message that we might want to use, but the user obviously is the one that's then able to select the language and be able to produce the final email and send it. And it's a really nice tool to use. We use it all the time, obviously, at work, and I think it's important that you know, when appropriate, that we are teaching our users the ability to be able to use email, because we live in a world where email is used a lot of the time. So the scaffolded email is a really nice approach. If we want to move beyond being scaffolded, we can look at, if I go into Grid Explorer, communicating, again, I'm going to stick with email, but using that and recording a piece of writing in still a more accessible form. But we have two versions of the email app, one that's the simple email and one that is the full email. If we go into simple, we've moved out of the scaffolded one that was in Grid 3, but I've got access to my inbox and I've got access to create an email. And when I go into here, my message will show at the top, and I'll have a list of contacts that will have already been added for me down the bottom, and I can create an email. And what you can see is that I've still got access to language to support me to do the writing, but I'm probably going to be doing a bit more independent writing in this. And it's also given me quite a clean and not too busy access to the email app that I'm using. In other messages here, we can see that we've got a bit more information, and again, I can tailor all of these. They can be edited. I've got access to a keyboard, and we can add photos as well. So it's a really nice way to use and start using email outside of the scaffolded email that we could see previously. I'm going to go back to Grid Explorer. The next level up from that would be an email which we could use, which is going to give us much more detail. If I go to new here, what we can see is we're moving on to the next level here. So I've now got access on the bottom left-hand side to be able to add my own contacts or be able to edit a contact. So we're starting to be much more independent with how we're supporting the use of email. And when I go into write an email, we're focusing much more here on the keyboard with predictive text across the top. So it's just a mix really of thinking what level the learner's at, but email is actually a really nice way to be able to record either in the moment or pre-planned, but to record somebody's work and be able to share it at the same time. So I'm just going to pass over to Adam, and Adam's going to carry on talking about recording, but even more advanced than the sort of apps that we've been looking at.
Yeah, so I'll just start by sharing my screen. Give me a moment. Okay, hopefully you can see that. Can you, Kerry?
Yeah.
Great. So just to pick off then from where Kerry was. So Kerry had been talking about that, firstly, that sort of scaffolded approach to recording, and then to, for example, to write an email in a different form of communication. But we might be here, for example, checking our inbox, but this is full screen and it's a very structured approach, very structured layout. So in terms of our accessibility, we're trying to make sure there's the same number of cells on each screen and so on. But there comes a point when you want to just be able to do more. You might want to have that full control of your computer and do all the things that anyone else is doing in their email or in their other means of recording, whether it's Microsoft Word, searching websites and so on. So when we were using Fast Talker in Kerry's example, we can write a simple email, we can add a simple photo as an attachment, but we're relying on those things. And being able to do more than that is the point at which we might need to introduce something called computer control. So there's a couple of different ways we can handle computer control. Computer control is where grid shrinks to occupy just some of the screen, allowing you to see other applications at the same time and to control them. So within Fast Talker, as an example of a text-based AAC solution, you do have a link to some computer control grids here. So I'll just flick that up very quickly so we can see that. And you can see here that this would be ideal for someone perhaps who is using eye gaze as an access method. But on the right side, we've got a narrow bar, which is still grid. But you can see the rest of my desktop here, and I can begin to use the functions here to control my applications and to launch applications, close applications, use a keyboard and so on. I'm going to come back to Grid Explorer though, and I'm going to go into a standalone computer control grid set. So let's come back to Grid Explorer. And I'm going to come into a folder here, and you'll see here I've got two options. I'm going to start by showing you what currently everyone has access to. So here is a computer control grid set, looks exactly the same as you would have seen. So you'll see that the same grid sets are often built into our main grid sets like Fast Talker and so on. And I can access left click. I can choose to launch Microsoft Word if I want to. Okay, so I'm using Zoom to click there, which is a form of making that access easier for someone who might be using eye gaze or a head mouse, for example. I can then begin to access a blank document. Again, I might do a left click and select, and that Zoom takes me in to what might otherwise be a small target and makes it that much easier. I've got a keyboard, so I can begin to type as anybody else would. I can save my document and so on. However, that's not going to be right for all access methods and for all users, and there's some shortcuts we can take to make that a bit easier. So I'm going to just close Word for a second, and I'm going to come into a different grid set, and I'm going to give you a little bit of a sneak preview really. The clue is that this grid is called previews, so we reserve the right to make some minor changes, but it's just about here. So I can quite confidently say it's going to be released in the summer. You can work out how long summer lasts, but I think it's expected in the next couple of months. So this is a revamped version of our computer control grids, but this is something where we might be using all access methods. So we might well be using a switch, which presents its own difficulties when it comes to making something accessible for someone. So I'm going to just choose where I want the grid to position, and with changes in current technology, that might become more important with Windows 11 coming in. But for now, I'm going to go for a traditional position where my computer control grid sits across the bottom of the screen. So here I've got a similar idea. I've got a layout at the bottom where I've got my mouse options. I've got a keyboard. I've got the ability to move this grid. If it gets in the way on the taskbar at the bottom of my screen, I can move it. But I can also use the grid to start some programs. So here I've got some ready-made starting points, and you can see some that are populated. The typical examples: Word, Chrome, Edge, a calculator, etc. The things that we know are likely to appear on a Windows computer. And then there's the option to add some blanks there that you can add your own. So in this example, I'm going to use my grid to launch Microsoft Word. So I'm no longer having to go and navigate to the icon for Word on my desktop. I can just click on that, that icon, and it launches Microsoft Word for me. Now, I might then want to be able to do a left click or an enter. Now, if I was a keyboard user, a switch user, one way in which I might do that, for example, is to bring my keyboard up. So I'm cheating slightly here by using my mouse, but I will revert to my switch in a moment. And then I want to just be able to press enter, which is all the way over here. So I can start my switch scan. I'd move down to the right row, and then I would wait for it to travel all the way to the end. Now, when you're doing a 35-minute webinar, this is the point where I'm going to cheat. And I'm going to click enter, but you get the idea. And you can see there that it has launched Microsoft Word, it's placed the cursor in the right place, and I can begin to type with all the tools that we're going to offer to try and speed up typing for somebody. So I'm able to use prediction in the normal way. Now, this same principle might be applied to Outlook or Gmail, if that's what I was using. I can begin to use the tools within here to save, or I can learn some keyboard shortcuts. So I might want to, for example, be able to save this document now. So I might want to do a Control and then S, which is the keyboard shortcut to save a document. Okay. Now, because I'm just demonstrating this, I might also have changed my mind, and it may be that I want to be able to close that that window that's open. Knowing your keyboard shortcuts at this point is really helpful. So I think an escape key would get me out of that. Or if I didn't have my keyboard shortcuts, I'd need to be able to use a mouse. So as a mouse user, or sorry, as a switch user, I'm going to perhaps use my mouse options here, which I've got. I can go to more. I've got some more options here, copy, paste. So I could have copied something from Fast Talker. Let's have a look and see if we wanted to use a left click, for example. Okay, and then you can see that's an example with eye gaze. An escape key would have done it otherwise. Or I could use something like radar mouse to move my mouse around. I don't want to go out of Grid Explorer, just take one or two more things to show you. So I can control my mouse, I can control my keyboard, I can control third-party applications. I'm going to give you another example of a different third-party application. So manage Windows. I'm going to close that one. You can see the option comes up, save, don't save, cancel. I could close that window again. I can just use, I'm just going to cheat and use don't save there, but I'd be able to navigate that button if I wanted to. I'm going to go to home, start programs, and I'm going to use some web controls this time. Now, I'm going to launch Microsoft Edge, and that's the default option here, simply because we know it's going to be on every Windows computer. But you saw a moment ago that I also had shortcuts to popular browsers like Google Chrome. But I can use the same way. I can use Microsoft Edge to launch, and it's launching an application for me, so it's starting that program. And I've got all the tools that I might want to begin to navigate through a web browser. So it's launching the default web page. I can have a new tab if I want to. I can scroll if I want to. So I can say I'm going to have a medium scroll, and when I look up at the web browser or move my mouse across the web browser, it's moving. When I come off it, it stops. I can nudge it if I want to move a bit more slowly. It's just nudging down as I go. Okay, so there's a few tools here to help you, and these tools are really just keyboard shortcuts. That's all it is. We're relying on the accessibility of the program. So you'll have heard web accessibility being talked about before by Neil and others. Good web accessibility is going to mean something that can be managed without having to grab your mouse. And that really helps us and our users when it comes to things like computer control. So I'm going to shift themes here slightly now. I'm going to close that web browser. And I'm going to go back into Grid Explorer and think a little bit more about another way in which we might promote independence. And that is thinking about environmental control. So I'm going to come into think about some of our other means of communication that we use. So we've got, before I go back to environmental control, skipping ahead there slightly, just thinking about some of the other tools that our users want to do. They don't just want to talk, or they don't want to just write an email. There's lots of other forms of communication they might want to use. They might be really motivated to use WhatsApp with their mates and their peers in the same way they may want to use Instagram. And they might well want to use emojis, because an emoji, it says the same in one click as many words might do. We all use a thumbs up and a tongue out and a high five symbol when we're writing WhatsApp or text messages these days, and our users want to be able to do the same. So you looked earlier at email and SMS, but WhatsApp is one good example of how we all communicate. I know me and my team communicate, and Kerry and I communicate all the time by WhatsApp. So if I click on Start, I've already set this up, but it is a 10-second process to set this up with a phone in hand. And it's connecting now to my WhatsApp, which is on my phone. I'm hoping there's not going to be anything too dramatically awful on my WhatsApp messages. Fortunately, Kerry's just messaged me and it's relatively polite. So you can see here in the same, it almost looks like my phone or your phone if you're a WhatsApp user. You've got your groups and your individual contacts. If I want to view or read that message, I can do that. I can go back to the next message or the previous message that she's written me, a thumbs up. If I want to reply to Kerry, I can reply and I can say, great, and I can send it. So that's a really simple message, but we can also send a GIF, for example. So I can choose to send all those things that that we use in WhatsApp messages. I can also view GIFs, view video, view audio, and so on. So it's giving me that same full functionality that you might use with your phone, but look how familiar the layout looks. So for someone with physical difficulties, that motor planning aspect can be really important, and it's the same layout as you saw earlier in Fast Talker. Every single one of our accessible apps, whether it's Instagram or an email or Facebook, or in this case, WhatsApp or Netflix, is laid out in a very similar way, offering the same sort of access to functionality. I daren't scroll to other groups, but take my word for it, you could, and I can scroll through to these other groups that are in the list using the buttons around the edge of the screen. I'm assuming that someone's going to struggle with interaction in this area, but manage whether they're using a pointer, eye gaze, switch, these other buttons down the outside. And I can also choose to send all sorts of media as well. If I just step out of that for a moment. So I should also, just to say, anything I show you now would also be available in many of our main grid sets. So I'm using these accessible apps, we call them plugins. They're standalone grids that you can add to any other grid set. but they're often built into a grid set like Fast Talker would be a good example of where you'd find them. So just literally just show you what a different app might look like. This is Instagram. Now you can probably almost tell just by looking at me that I'm not a frequent user of Instagram, but you can see how familiar the layout looks to WhatsApp now, and that same functionality is there. If I want to scroll down and see what's been going on, I can see what special effect have been up to. I can see what colleagues might have been up to, and so on. So we can create a message, a post now, which is a new update actually in Instagram. It's only recently that Instagram as a platform have made it accessible enough to allow us to do those things. So it's a really good pat on the back for Instagram that we can now finally use all the things on a computer that we could use on a phone previously. So our users are able to get full access to all that functionality that they want. Okay, so many of the other accessible apps, things like Facebook or Netflix, or Disney Plus and so on, work in the same way with the same sort of layout. I can almost call it like a scaffolded approach to access, not having to fiddle around with small screens or lots of pop-ups and so on. It manages all those things for you.
About 5 minutes, Adam, I think.
Thank you. Yeah, that was a good heads up. Now I'm going to just mention briefly something else. We're beginning to think a little bit about environmental control now. If I was, for example, to go back into Fast Talker for a second, just to say, there's an example of how they're plugged into the grid set. So what you've just seen is available there too. But if I wanted, for example, to come into my messages, the home interface or the grid explorer, the main home screen of Fast Talker, I might want to, for example, to set up an alarm call for someone. If someone needs help, they might want to quickly gain attention. This is an example. Send someone an urgent SMS, send someone a text message. You could copy this cell and have one that says, I need help immediately, and one that says, can you give me a hand with this piece of coursework I'm working on? Anytime in the next half hour will be fine. So you can set up different SMS messages, or you can go to sort of more of an environmental control effect, have something like a pager that is triggered. So I was thinking about environmental control for a second. We might want to think about, when we think about environmental control, we often think about someone having full control of a TV or full control of their house, their smart house, doors, windows, etc. But actually the motivating starting point might be much simpler than that. It might be making use of what we now think of as mainstream technology. And this is a simple grid set I found on Online Grid with 4 big cells on it, which is set up to control an Amazon Alexa. So each of these cells is going to hopefully say something.
Alexa, play the Wiggles.
So in this instance, this grid set has been set up with real voice, and someone's left at that deliberate pause between Alexa and the command, which is what is often needed. But that might be a really, really motivating activity for someone. And this one has clearly been set up for perhaps a young child. They've got the Wiggles and SpongeBob and SquarePants on there and so on. So we could look at a different example. We might be thinking about something that's built into Fast Talker as well, like this. So we go to the other end of the spectrum where we are now controlling all of Amazon Alexa, and we're using the computer's own voice to control it. So one quick example might be music, song. Let's just choose a simple example for now. Artist. I want to play some Taylor Swift or some Ed Sheeran, perhaps.
Alexa, play some Ed Sheeran.
With whatever my public voice is, you can see there that I'm no longer using a recorded voice, and that will then play Ed Sheeran as long as my device is within sounding distance of that smart speaker. That approach doesn't have to be an Amazon Alexa speaker. It could be a Google Home speaker or any of these smart speakers that's been used. And we've certainly got users who are using to control their homes and so on as well. A stepping stone to that, or one other thing to think about there, if you've got the right hardware, is to think about what other environmental control you could be doing. So I've showed you a couple of things with smart TVs there. I come back out to Grid Explorer for a moment, we might also want to be thinking about more traditional environmental control, where we're actually controlling a real TV or a real fan or light, for example. This is an example of a radio socket. I've got a very simple light socket in it, but something like a grid pad device will talk to that socket. So you can send a radio signal to that socket to make it do something. And that might be in a cookery lesson to turn on the food mixer or to boil a kettle. But in this instance, it might also be to control a fan or to control a bubble tube or some other motivating or real technology plug-in device. Alongside that, you've got those tools that allow you to control a TV. In this example, and this is called the simple service grid, it's a very simple grid controlling power, volume and channel. But we might also see an example which is more fully functioning, doing all the things you might expect from a TV. And in Fast Talker, if I go to the service pages, you can now see something that looks a bit more like a remote control. And I can begin to program up to send to go and watch BBC Two or Now TV or whatever it is I'm trying to control. Okay, so that was a real whistle-stop tour of some of the things we might want to think about when it comes to computer control, motivating alternative forms of communication and environmental control. Now, the things that Kerry and I have been talking about, you've seen a few examples today where we haven't used default grid sets that we've made that are part of Grid 3 ecosphere, but we have made use of online grids. So do make use. If you're in Grid 3, or you can go straight to the Online Grids website, just search for online grids. We find a whole load of content here, and we're not the only people that are writing it. There are lots of people in the community writing appropriate content that you could beg, borrow, steal, and adapt. So whether that's being a grid set for a smart speaker, so if I was looking for something, I can just begin to type Amazon Alexa, for example, and it'll just search and let me look for the kind of content I'm looking for, although it's having a think about it right now.
Usually the search is quicker than that.
Yeah, normally it is. Yeah, and I should say, while you're just staying a buffering screen, there we go, we can search for categories. So if you're looking for particular things, now it's coming in. You can see that now my search returns are being offered, and you can see I showed you this example, which is something from Australia, but there's lots of other examples that you can use there. And
I was going to say, one of our key takeaways is we always say never try and reinvent the wheel. So quite often we will search for a grid set, download it, and then we always talk a lot about reverse engineering. So when you just put it in edit mode and you can see how it works, and then we just make the changes we need.
Yeah, and this is a grid set I really like. It is something that we wrote some time ago, but we don't provide anymore. It's a package we don't sell, but you could make use of this if you're just starting out with environmental control. It's a really nice way of getting someone just to begin to use, for example, a fan or a bubble tube or a starlight, and there's some infrared toys there that you could use. You do have to think about what hardware you've got, because when it comes to things like controlling infrared remote controls, you obviously need something that's going to send an infrared code as well. So when it comes to that, you might be using something like a grid pad, for example, which I've got next to me. It's got the built-in required hardware, but there are other ways to manage simple environmental control as well. So yeah, absolutely, don't start from scratch is usually our takeaway.
Okay.
Brill. I'll stop sharing my screen. And we probably are a few minutes over, Neil.
Sorry, Neil.
No, don't be sorry. Don't be sorry. That was fantastic. There was a lot to cover there, to be fair. I think it's always better for me to say 35 and then go a little bit over.
I mean, we could have spent probably the 35 on each of the sections.
Absolutely.
It was really to prompt ideas. So if anybody's got questions, they can just either ask now or email us later.
Yeah, that'd be great. If anyone has any questions, please ask them. I can say from my experience of the grid, lots of them start out with lots and lots of features. It's really useful, but it's so easy just to kind of go into edit mode and just kind of take out some of those features if it's too much for your students. And maybe you'll bring back those features after a while, but it's completely customizable. If there's a button that's too small, make it bigger. If there's text too small, make it bigger. If you want symbols instead of pictures or pictures instead of symbols, so much of it comes out of the ready straight away to use, but then you can also edit it. So it's really good for either beginners or advanced people. And there's so much support available from Smartbox. So
well, we're aware that we showed you a lot there, but we hope that we showed you so many different layouts and content to give you a flavour of exactly what you've just talked about there, Neil, which is whether it's symbols or photos or text or computer control, or you're just beginning to understand what an email is. There's lots of different starting points that you can tap into. Yeah,
that's it. It's really good once you've got the kind of the strategy and the kind of guidelines from your speech language therapist around the individual student. You can start altering the grid to kind of fit that student, and trial and error part of the time as well. So if you've got any questions, then feel free to put your hands up, and I'll just kind of share our final screen. There we go. If you've got any questions or you want any follow-up from this, we could do another grid webinar in the future if you're happy to, Smartbox. Maybe on editing and that side of things. Failing that, Smartbox have lots of YouTube tutorials and things like that.
Neil, you made a good point in the chat. Your comment about Microsoft Word, how you can build, I call it macro building, which sounds like it's a bit high end. It's not really, but you're right. You can build a button that does a number of different things. Your example was in Microsoft Word. And with my students, when I was a teacher, I always used to talk about what is it you're trying to get that student to convey? Is it their understanding and their knowledge, or are you trying to say that they need to copy off the board every last thing? And actually, we often used to start a Microsoft Word where there are some things on a button that could drop in some chunks of text or some prerequisites to the bit that comes next, which is the bit that's really important for the student to explain. My go-to example always used to be setting up students in science lessons where they didn't need to say, I think it's a fair test because, but it was the bit that came after because was important. So that was the bit I wanted to hear from them on, not the first bit. So they made a button that would launch their program, put a date in, put their form name in it, and then drop in that first starting point. The rest came from the student.
Yeah, that makes sense. There's an awful lot you can do with your computer to make it more compatible with computer control. So the one that I often do is to make the icons on the screen bigger, to make the text bigger, to put in some favorites for the students, so kind of favorite programs or favorite documents, renames things so they're nice and clear. There's a lot you can do with the grid, with Windows as well. It
brings it back round to we mentioned a lot about personalization, and I think whether it's an AAC grid set, a computer control, whether you're looking at recording, it's making even the EC is making sure that's all personalized for the user. It's the right EC to motivate them or to allow them to do what they want to, and that we've got the right setup for any different way they're using grid.
Great, well thanks. Today I know some of these tools are some of the most exciting things that students will be able to get into to communicate with their friends and family, to get into kind of apps that they're really interested. So that's been really useful. If anyone has any other requests of things they'd like us to do with webinars on, then feel free to email us, techability@natspec.org.uk. You can catch us at Twitter @tech_ability1. I've also put in our links for our website and all of our webinars. This webinar will be put up onto YouTube, so you can share it around with your colleagues. And all that remains is to say thank you to Kerry and thank you to Adam for another really interesting webinar.
Thank you.
Thanks, Neil. Thanks, everyone.